If you're looking for one of the most delicious fried foods, look no further than this Japanese tonkatsu recipe. It consists of the juiciest pork cutlets coated in shatteringly crisp panko. It's outstandingly delicious, and it's pretty easy to make if you follow this recipe. Welcome back to my ongoing series where I teach recipes starting from the easiest all the way up to multi-step intensive showstoppers. If you're not feeling super confident in the kitchen, go ahead and join me on this journey. Equipment-wise, we're gonna need a cutting board, a chef's knife, a pot to fry our pork in, prep bowls and containers for the breading process, a rice cooker or your preferred rice pot, a thermometer, some tongs, and a wire rack with a sheet tray. A scale is also going to be really nice, but I can give you the recipe in tablespoons as well. The difficulty in this dish lies in the balance between a perfectly juicy interior and a dry, crispy exterior. You need to simultaneously drive out the moisture from the breading and maintain all the moisture in the pork. It's a hard balance to strike. For juiciness, let's use a rib chop, which is basically a ribeye. It's the exact same cut. I like it because it's fatty, but you could opt for standard pork chops here. Remove the bone by slicing against it and following it all the way to where the bone ends on the back of the piece. If your pieces are thick like mine are, you can pound them out. That's what I'm gonna do. Or you could cut them in half down the middle. You want them about ½ inch thick either way you go, so aim for that. Place your deboned pork in a bag and smash it with your fists, a mallet, or just the bottom of a heavy pot. I'm just gonna use the pot that I'm gonna fry these in. Like I mentioned, you want them about ½ inch thick here. Any fat that's along the outside of the pork creates a cupped piece. That leaves a little bit of a dry, pale spot rather than brown crispiness everywhere. The fat does give you a little bit of juiciness, but also it's not gonna give you a ton, and the intermuscular fat is more important than the fat that's on the outside. With our pork perfectly thin and the fat removed, season both sides heavily with salt and let it come up to room temperature. If we fry our pork at room temperature, it's gonna keep more of the breading, and the time that we give it just allows the salt to penetrate the meat. It's a win-win. If you wanna get super crazy, don't tell anybody, but you can totally season both sides with MSG as well. These steps ensure that the pork is going to maintain all of the perfect juiciness that we crave. Tonkatsu sauce is such an interesting thing as it falls into the category of Japanese foods that are based on Western flavors and palates. So although this dish is Japanese, it utilizes ketchup in Worcestershire sauce. Dishes like this tonkatsu fall into this category called Yoshoku, which is those Western style dishes, but in reality they're Japanese. It's this sort of cool fusion type of food that is not gaudy with its fusion. It just sort of, it is what it is. It's Japanese, that's inspired by Western food, that is now completely, totally Japanese, and it's just this sort of circle of life, chicken and egg. I think it's a super, super cool style of cooking and gives us a lot of our favorite Japanese dishes like this tonkatsu. To make the tangy sauce, combine 60 grams of ketchup, 20 grams of oyster sauce, 20 grams of Worcestershire sauce, 5 grams of sugar, and 10 grams of rice wine vinegar. Mix this together and store it in the fridge so the sauce can become one cohesive flavor. You could also just buy tonkatsu sauce at the store. Bulldog is a really good brand that people really like. This tastes super similar, if not a little bit more tangy and less sweet. They're both delicious, they're both good ways to go. If you don't feel like making it, just go ahead and seek out the Bulldog sauce. The two classic pairings for katsu are rice and thinly sliced cabbage. The cabbage can easily be taken care of by cutting the head in half and then removing the dense core. I like to cut that half into halves so you've got quarters, and then make thin cuts as best as you can by using the claw grip that we've been utilizing. Keep the slices super thin, that way you can create an easily snackable pile of cabbage. Wash your cabbage in cold water and then you could drain it in the salad spinner, but I always just use my hand as sort of a colander and pour out the water. I let it sit in the fridge so it stays cold and it'll be ready and prepped to go when our katsu is fried. For the rice, I always keep around this medium grain calrose rice. It's really good for any kind of Asian recipes, especially Japanese dishes. Weigh out 200 grams of the rice and wash it until the water runs clear. Pop it into a rice cooker with 200 mils of water and a pinch of salt. Run the machine and you'll have the perfect side for our katsu. Whenever I fry anything at home, I try to keep a setup like this. The pot with the oil is gonna sit in the middle at the stove. To the right is gonna be the raw ingredients with a set of tongs or something to get our pork into the oil with. In this case, I'm actually just gonna use my hand. To the left is a wire rack with a clean set of tongs to rest our cooked pork on. Salt is gonna be nearby to season the food, and I'm also gonna keep a thermometer to make sure that the temperature doesn't get out of control. Frying is dangerous, but luckily in our case, we're not gonna be frying with a ton of oil in a massive pot. For our tonkatsu, add half vegetable oil and half lard into the pot. The lard also helps lend to that like extra porky flavor, and I think it's just a nice touch, but if you didn't have it nearby, you could use all vegetable oil. The amounts are gonna vary depending on the size of your pot. I usually get it to just about the height of the pork, make sure it's not touching the bottom, and then it's good to go. Begin heating your oil so it's ready the second your pork is breaded. Medium or medium low is a safe bet until it hits 350 degrees Fahrenheit. That's gonna be our frying temperature. The standard breading procedure for pretty much any item is to create a 3-step station. The first step, the flour, is gonna help dry out the exterior of the food and give the egg wash something to stick to. Without it, that egg wash would just slide right off. The egg wash is there to create a wet coating for the final ingredient, the crunch factor. In the case of fried chicken, the final ingredient would just be more flour. In the case of Italian chicken cutlets, the final ingredient would be standard breadcrumbs. For katsu, panko is the required component. These breadcrumbs are larger, flakier, and fluffier. This gives you a perfectly flaky crunch rather than like a hard crunch that cuts up your gums like some cereals do. In one bowl, crack and beat 2 large eggs. I like to add a little bit of water and a pinch of salt to that, and then I mix it up so that there's no whites remaining. You don't want any streaks. You want this completely homogenized. For the second container, one with high sides, add in about 90 grams of panko. I just always eyeball this, pour enough for the pieces that you've got. We're gonna dry off any excess moisture from the exterior of the pork using a paper towel, and then I just add enough flour to coat them. Make sure every inch is covered because again, this is gonna help that egg wash stick. At this stage, we can pretty much move over to the stove. The oil should be at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. We've got everything set up, and we wanna make sure that this goes in right after it's breaded. To do that, we need to do this right next to the stove. Dunk your pork into the egg wash until it's completely coated, and then drop the pork into the panko. It's important to press this panko into the pork so as much of it as possible is gonna stick to it. Press both sides in until every bit of pork is covered with those flaky breadcrumbs. Once your pork is breaded, you can gently lower each piece into your hot oil. Depending on your pot size, you may be able to fit 1 or 2, but definitely don't overcrowd your pan. If your pot and your pieces are like mine, 1 at a time is gonna be the way to go, but if you can fit them all safely, go for it. Once your katsu is in, set a 4-minute timer and begin gently moving the pieces so they don't stick to the bottom. At the 2-minute mark, give your piece a flip and continue moving it around. I find that this 4-minute time gives a beautifully crispy brown exterior without overcooking and drying the pork itself. Continue moving your pan. You could use a spoon to help kind of spoon the oil over the top. I usually just grab the handle and very, very gently wiggle the pan back and forth. This creates a little bit of motion, gets more oil on the top, and make sure that everything is cooking evenly. Once the timer goes off, remove the katsu from the oil and set it on a rack to dry. As it dries and rests, hit it with some salt, and then I like to flip it every minute or so. If it rests too long on one side, that bottom side tends to get greasy. It's where the oil is gonna wick out and fall because of gravity. So if you flip it, it gives a chance for the oil to distribute, for everything to kind of dry out evenly, and you end up with crunchy both sides rather than like one side sitting in a pool of oil at the bottom. These pieces need at least 4 minutes to cool on the rack. It's basically the same amount of time that they cooked for. This actually helps cook the pieces more evenly because there's still some heat attached from all of that oil, and it allows it to sort of air out. You're not gonna end up with a greasy product that way. Just make sure you're not slicing them the second that they come out of the pan, or you're gonna end up losing a lot of that juice. Work through your pieces in batches, hit them with salt as they come out, continue flipping them as they cool, and give these the time that they need to become beautifully brown, crispy, and ready to eat. For serving, I like to slice these into like medium thick pieces. I don't want super thin, I want these to be able to be picked up with chopsticks. This juice is what you get when you take the time to salt your pork beforehand and really care for the seasoning. Let's get ready to serve and eat this beautiful thing. I gotta be honest, I like a little bit of mayo on my cabbage. It gives it a little bit more of like an actual salad type vibe. Kewpie mayo is always great for this. You don't have to, just a little bit of a nice thing. But you are absolutely gonna wanna make this because it is crispy, it is juicy, it is porky, it is perfectly salty. That tonkatsu sauce helps cut it with the sugary, like dark, tangy flavors. Oh, it is so, so good. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here. If you're looking for a recipe that's a little bit easier, check out last week's video on Hanani's chicken rice. There's no frying involved, so if you're afraid of frying, that's really a good one to take a look at. If you're looking for something a little bit more difficult, go ahead and subscribe because every week there's another recipe on the way. If you do make this, go ahead and tag me on Instagram at CameronCookedThis so I can share your progress as well as mine. Massive shout out to the amazing people supporting me directly on Patreon through patreon.com/CameronMarty. They get some cool benefits for supporting the channel, and I get to keep the lights on. Thank you again for watching. Cheers.